Hi, welcome to Train Signal. My name's Bill and this lesson is preparing for SharePoint installation. Alright gang, I know we're excited. I know we want to go ahead and get our SharePoint farm up and running so that we can start playing with some of those really cool SharePoint things that we've heard so much about. But before we even touch that SharePoint server, there's a few things that we need to go ahead and do first to make sure that our installation goes smoothly. And the very first thing that we're going to do is configure some service accounts in Active Directory. Now we're doing this for added security and organization. And we're going to do this using the concept of least privilege. Now, what this means is we are going to assign only what is needed for the account to function. And that means you can control and manage the exact level of permissions that SharePoint can operate under. This is a very, very important thing. And if you need to learn more about least privilege, you're not quite sure what it means, certainly, by all means, go ahead and look it up. It might not be a bad idea to do a little bit more research if you're not familiar with it. And in fact, your organization may already have some policies and procedures in place concerning least privilege. Now we're going to go ahead and we are going to create 3 main accounts. The first one is our SQL Server service account. Our SQL Server service account, quite simply, is the account that's used to run SQL Server. And because our SQL Server is separate from our SharePoint server, we're not setting them up on the same box, our SQL Server service account needs to be a domain user account. And that's what we're going to go ahead and set up in just a few minutes. The next account we'll set up is going to be our SharePoint setup user account. I know these are really, really simple. Can you guess what this one does? That's right. This is our setup user account, and it's used to run the following: SharePoint setup and our SharePoint products configuration wizard. We need to have this account in place for that. Again, this is another domain user account. This account needs to be a member of the local administrators group on each server that SharePoint is going to be installed on. It also has to have a SQL Server login on our SQL Server, and it needs to be a member of the following SQL Server roles: Security Admin and DB Creator. And again, I'm going to show you all of this. I'm just telling you now, when you get there, you don't say, hey, what is that? You're going to see all of this in just a few minutes. And the last account we're going to set up is going to be our server farm / database access account. And as the name implies, the server farm account is used to configure and manage the server farm. It also will act as the application pool identity for the SharePoint Central Administration website, and it will also run the SharePoint Foundation Workflow Timer service. This account also needs to be a domain user account, and it will also need additional permissions, such as DB Creator, Security Admin, and DB Owner. But the server farm account is automatically added as a SQL Server login on our SQL Server. So it's going to do all of that for us automatically, whereas with our SharePoint setup user account, we're going to have to do it manually ourselves. And this account will not be part of the local administrators group. Now you can also create an account for every service. You don't have to, but you can. Services like the application pool account, an application pool account for the Excel service application, and so on. SharePoint has lots of services, and you can create a service account for every single one if you want. Now that takes a lot of timing, a lot of work, and a lot of planning beforehand. And if it's something that you feel that you need, you can do it. And again, I'm going to tell you, it will take a lot of time, but you're going to want to do that first rather than trying to change it after the fact. So think about how you're going to use those services, how you're going to divide them up, and how many people are going to be using these services, what your load is going to be on those individual services. And we're going to talk more about this kind of stuff in a future lesson. Well, enough of talking about it. Let's go ahead and let's add these service accounts so that we can move on to the next step in preparing for our installation. We're going to go ahead and switch over to our domain controller now. Okay, so here we are at our domain controller, named GM for GlobalMantics -DC1-12 because it is Windows Server 2012. And let's open up our Active Directory users and computers. We have the Global Mantics domain. I'm going to go to my users folder. We see our standard users, plus there are some things in here, some users in here that we would see because we have Exchange up and running on our domain, and we need to create that first service account. So we'll go to our users folder, right click, choose new, and select user. And we need to give this account a name. Now you can call it anything you want, but it's probably best to go ahead and give it a name that's obvious as to what it is, so that you or somebody who may come after you sees that account and doesn't wonder, what the heck is this account for? So the name is usually pretty important. You want to keep it obvious. So I'm going to call this one SPSQL for SharePoint SQL. Now, I like to use the caps because it makes it real easy to see when you're looking at a whole list full of accounts. So let's put it in here as well. Choose next. Give it a password. For my purposes, I'm going to say that the password never expires. Probably not a good thing to do in general, but for our purposes, for demonstration, that's fine. Choose next and finish. And there's our SP SQL account. It is a domain user account. It's here under our Global Mantics domain. So let's go ahead, let's create our next service account. Go to users, new, user. And this is going to be our SharePoint setup or install account. Now I've seen people call it SP install, SP admin, all kinds of different things. Again, it doesn't really matter what you call it as long as it's something that you can recognize. So I'm going to call this one SP admin. And again, I like all caps. SP admin. And we'll give it a password, my super secret password. And again, for our purposes, we're going to have it so that the password never expires. Great. That's 2. Now we are going to go ahead and have to give this a SQL Server login and some SQL Server roles as a security admin and DB creator. But we can't do that until we get our SQL up and running. So we will have to deal with this count a little bit later. But I'd like to get it in here now so that we're not forgetting about it when the time comes. All right, now let's go ahead and let's create our one last account. And this is going to be our SharePoint Farm account. And again, another simple, easy to remember name, SP Farm. Pretty straightforward, easy to remember. Give it our password, and again, don't necessarily go by my password policy because I'm doing it for ease of demonstration. Great, and that's all we need to do here in Active Directory for right now. So let's go ahead and now go to our SQL Server. Okay, the next step in our preparation for SharePoint is getting our SQL Server up and running. And some of you out there might be saying, Bill, this is a SharePoint class, not SQL. Why do I need to know this? Well, we do know that SharePoint uses SQL Server. You have to have your SQL Server if you're going to run SharePoint. And a lot of us out there, especially if we don't have SharePoint up and running already, may have never put our hands on a SQL Server. We may not know anything about SQL. And that's what we're doing this for. Hey, if you've installed SQL Server a dozen times and you know this backwards and forwards, then hey, by all means, fast forward right through to the next section. But a lot of us never had any experience with SQL and don't know how to get it up and running, don't know what we need to do to prepare it for our SharePoint. So I thought it was worthwhile for us to go through the steps of getting our SQL Server up and running with a very basic, simple install for a basic use in our SharePoint. So that's what we're going to go ahead and do. Now, I'm going to open this up. I've already mounted this ISO file, my SQL Server. It's SQL Server 2012 with Service Pack 1, and we're running it on a separate SQL Server. This is a separate machine. It is separate from our SharePoint server and our domain controller and our Exchange server for all of that. And it is part of our Global Mantics domain, and of course it is also Windows Server 2012. So we're going to just start by running our setup. There we go. Please wait while the setup is in process. All right, looks good. Our SQL Server Installation Center. And we are going to click over here on the left to the second option, Installation. Now, lots of different things here, but of course this is a new SQL Server standalone installation or add features to an existing installation. This is the one we want. We're going to click there. Wait for a second while it does its thing. There we go. So now SQL is running a rule check. It's going to check and see if there's any potential problems that we might have during our installation. Let's open this up and show the details. And wow, it looks good. Everything is there that we need. Now, if there had been an issue, instead of seeing all of the green checks over here on the left, we would have seen either yellow warnings or red errors telling us that there was a problem. And then we could have expanded that and found out what the solution was. For example, if you take a look here at the bottom, you see the .NET 2.0 and .NET 3.5 Service Pack 1 update for Windows 2008. Now, this wasn't an issue for us because we're running this on Server 2012, so that update was already there. But if you were using, say, Server 2008 R2, that might have been an issue. You would have had to go and install that update, that patch, whatever it was. But everything is good for us here, so let's go ahead and let's move on. We'll click OK. And we'll go to the next step. Now we're simply just going to use an evaluation version of our SQL for now, so let's choose Next. Rather than entering a product key, we're going to accept license terms. Next. And it's scanning for updates, downloading the setup files, or extracting setup files if necessary. It skipped those because we have the ISO, everything is there that we need, and it's in progress for installing the setup files. Oh, and look at that. There we go. Well, that was pretty quick, but the installation isn't done yet, so hang in there with me. It's not that fast and easy. And this is another check to see if we're going to have any problems with our installation. And as you see, we didn't fail anything, but we have one warning. And notice down here that is Windows Firewall. Let's click on Warning. The Windows Firewall is enabled. Make sure that the appropriate ports are open to enable remote access. Now, this is very important. This is only a warning. It's not a failure. And this is not going to prevent us from continuing with the installation. And that's a good thing. We're just going to go ahead. We're going to leave this live for right now. We're going to let the installation finish. And when we're done, we're going to go back and deal with this firewall. What we're going to have to do is open a port in our Windows Firewall so that SharePoint can go ahead and reach out and touch that SQL Server and create that database. Okay? But like I said, we're going to do that a little bit later on. So we're good. We have no failures. So let's go and choose Next. And we have a couple of options here. We can do the SQL Server feature installation, and this is a basic installation. This is what we're going to look at. We also have the ability to add in the SQL Server Power Pivot for SharePoint. We're not going to go and do that. Remember, folks, we're starting with our SharePoint. This is our first experience with it. Before we get into the really fancy things, we're going to start with a very basic installation. And down the road, once you get used to it and you want to try all of these things, you can always go back and add them in. And then this will be a full installation, everything with the defaults. Again, we don't need all of that. There's a lot of stuff in here that we're not going to do. So we're going to choose the SQL Server feature installation so that we can go and select the features that we want. Now for us, the only things we need are the database engine services, and we want to have our management tools. Now we want the database engine services because, well, the database engine is what's going to create our databases for us, and it's also going to be responsible for storing, processing, and securing that data. And we want the management tools because that is the interface which will allow us to interact with our databases. And again, notice that there are some other SharePoint things in here, but before we try and get fancy with all of that stuff, let's get our SharePoint up and running, and we can always come back and do that a little bit later. So this looks good. We can look down here. We see our shared feature directories, and if you're going to split up your SQL Server onto different disks or different servers, this is where you can go and redirect them. But for us, again, it's fine just the way we are. We're going to leave the defaults, choose Next. And while it's waiting, it's once again checking to make sure that everything is good. Let's show our details. Look at that. Everything is good. So far, everything is going great. We're doing really, really good. Let's go ahead and choose Next. All right, now, this is a new instance of SQL Server, so we're using the default, and it's giving us that instance. That's great. This is where we want to install it. That's all great. This looks good. Nothing we have to do here. We leave our defaults. Let's go ahead and choose Next. Again, it's telling me this is how much space we need. This is how much we have. I think we're good. Everything looks great here. Again. Now, here we go. This is where, when we created that SP SQL account, this is where that's going to come into play. We now have to tell it who that SQL Server agent is. Now, it's giving us something here that is not what we want, NT Server SQL. We're going to browse and simply look for our SP SQL account. There it is, SPSQL at globalmantics.com. So now we know that the server is reached out to the domain controller, our Active Directory has found that account, and that's great. That is exactly what we want. And we will do the server database engine. We're going to do the same thing. And again, we will use our SPSQL account. Look at that. And we need to go and put in our passwords. And we don't have to worry about the server browser because, as you can see, it's already disabled. So that's all we need to do here. Let's choose Next. All right, now we need to go ahead and specify our authentication mode. And we're going to go with the default, the Windows authentication. We don't need to do mixed mode. But one thing that we do have to do here is click and add the current user, who we are logged in as. And you can see that I am logged in as the Global Mantics Administrator. See that? SQL Server administrators have unrestricted access to the database engine. That's important for us because we need to have this account that we're signed in as also have access to that database engine. All right, that looks good. Go ahead and choose Next. Now, do we want to sign up for and send SQL Server error reports? It's up to you. I always like to go ahead and do that and try and give Microsoft as much information as they can to help us out in the future. Choose Next. And everything, running those checks again, everything looks good. We'll select Next. And it says they're ready to do the installation, and it's giving us a summary of what we're doing. Notice that's our SQL Server instance. All of the things that we selected we wanted to have installed. We have our Global Mantics Administrator. Yep, everything looks good. So let's go ahead and click on Install. And this is going to take a little bit of time, so what I'm going to do is pause the recording. And then when we come back, we'll go on to our next step. We still have a couple of more things we have to clean up before we're finished with SQL, all right? So let's just wait. I like to wait before I stop the recording to make sure that we get that little green bar at least starting to go across for us so that we know that we have some progress. There we go. All right, I'll see you in a little bit. Hey, there we are. I'm back, and look at that. We are all done, and let's take a double check. It looks like everything went swell. That's excellent. All right. We're going to close that up. Actually, I still have this open, so I'm going to close that as well. Well, that went really well, so let's go and let's get to our start screen. And there's all of our SQL features. Excellent. And the one we are going to go to right now is our SQL Management Studio. We'll let this fire up so we can check. And because it's the first time, look at that. Now, it should automatically give us our server name, which we saw was GM-SQL-12. And it did. If not, you may have to type it in there, but it should be. And let's connect to our, and there it is. Look at that. And we don't have any databases. We haven't created anything yet. SharePoint hasn't done anything, but our SQL is up and running. Pretty cool. Now, we are still not done. We have a few more things that we are going to have to take care of. Something called max degree of parallelism. Now, what the heck is that? I can hear you asking me right now, Bill, what are you talking about? Max degree of parallelism has to do with how SQL handles the processors on your server. Now, unless you're using a machine that only has one processor, and let's be honest, when was the last time we did that? You're going to have to go ahead and make this adjustment. Trust me on this. SharePoint will not be happy. By default, the max degree of parallelism is set to 0. We need to change that value to 1 for SharePoint. So let's go ahead, let's go back to our SQL Server, and let's do just that. We're still here in our SQL Server Management Studio, and we're going to go up here to our server, our GM SQL-12. We're going to right-click, and we're going to go all the way down to Properties. Now, it's kind of buried in here, but what you need to do is go to the Advanced Properties here, and look at that. See this parallelism? Let's scroll down so we can see the whole thing, and we see max degree of parallelism. And like I told you, it's set to 0. So we are going to change that to 1. And that's all we need to do for that. That's it. It's not a big deal, but trust me, you need to do it. Let's go ahead and click OK. And if we want to double check to make sure it's stayed, we can certainly do that. There it is. That is exactly what we need. Now, if you're interested in learning more about max degree of parallelism and what it is and how it works and other things you can do with it, I'm going to direct you to a couple of articles. This first one is on MSDN, and the second one is on TechNet. And both of these will give you a lot more information about max degree of parallelism and explain in greater detail than we need to go to in this course if you really want to learn more about what it is, how it works, what it does, and other settings you might be able to use to your advantage. All right, now what we're going to do is we're going to go back to our SQL Server and set up some SQL permissions. Remember when we created that SP admin account, I told you that we were going to have to go and create a login for that account and add some server roles. That's what we're going to do right now. Let's go back to our SQL Server. And the first thing we need to do is we need to add that SP admin to the local administrators group on our SQL Server. So let's go ahead here and edit local users and groups. We will open up groups. We'll open up our administrators group, click on add, and we will add our SP admin. There it is. Great. To the local administrators on our SQL Server. Then we have to go ahead and create that login in our SQL Management Studio. So we've got that open again. Make sure our server is selected. We'll go down to Security, expand that group, Logins, expand that group, right-click, choose New Login, and Windows authentication login name. Let's search first of all, because we already know that we want the GlobalMantics SP admin. Check that. Looks good. Okay. Beautiful. That's looking good. That is all we need to do right here for the login. But we also need to go and add those server roles. And if you remember, we want DB creator and security admin. And we can leave public as well. Choose OK. And again, there is our GlobalMantics SP admin login and those server roles. Great, great, great. Everything is looking great. We are done with our management console. There is one last thing that we need to do here on our SQL Server before we can actually go ahead and, yes, start working on our SharePoint server. And that is configure the Windows firewall to allow SQL Server access. Okay, remember when we went ahead and we started to install SQL, the second set of checkups that it ran, we got that warning. Everything passed, but we got one warning that told us about the Windows firewall. And I told you at the time, it wasn't going to stop us from finishing our installation. Everything was going to go fine. And it did. You saw that. Everything was great. But I also told you we were going to have to come back and deal with this issue later on. So this is what we're going to do now. We're going to open a port through our Windows firewall so that when SharePoint goes to try and create that database, it can go ahead and get there. So let's get back to our SQL Server. All right, so we're back at our SQL Server, and we'll need to get our firewall up. So let's look for that, Windows Firewall. There it is. And we have to create an inbound rule. So over here on the left, we see inbound rules. We'll click there, and here's a number of rules that already exist, but we need to create a new rule. So over here in the Actions pane, on the right, it says New Rule right at the top. That's what we want, and it is an inbound rule. We get this window for the new inbound rule wizard. It is a port. Remember, we're trying to open a port so that we can reach in and create that database. So the port, we'll choose Next. It is TCP and specific ports. For us, it's going to be port 1433. If we were using SSL, it would be 443. But we're not, so let's go ahead and select Next. Allow the connection. That's great. That's exactly what we want. We'll choose Next. And this is all good. The defaults, domain, private, and public. That's great. Choose Next. Let's give it a name so that when we're looking at this, we know what it is. Allow inbound port 1433. Great. Finish. And there's our rule right there. Excellent. So we can close that. And we actually can close our Management Studio. And we are done with our SQL Server. At least for this lesson. All right, let's go ahead now and let's jump over to our SharePoint server. And here we are on our SharePoint server. You'll see it is GMSP-13, GlobalMantics SharePoint-13, because it is SharePoint 2013, part of our GlobalMantics domain, and I'm running it on a Windows Server 2012 box. So, when we created those user accounts, I told you that the SP admin account was also going to have to be added to the local administrators group on every machine that's running SharePoint. Now, this is the only machine that's going to run SharePoint in our farm. We have a very small farm, but we still need to go and add it to our local administrators. So let's go ahead and let's do that. And we'll open up groups. We'll open up the administrators, and we will add SP admin. Beautiful. And we are good to go with that. All right. Now, I want you also to notice right now, because I had to add that to the group, I'm signed in as the domain admin. I'm signing in as globalmantic/administrator. To do what we're going to do now, we are going to sign in to this server as the SP admin under the SP admin account. So I'm going to go ahead here and sign out, and I'll sign back in, and I'll come right back. Now we need to go ahead and install our SharePoint prerequisites. And I know you're saying, wait a minute, Bill, isn't that what we've been doing? No. Well, I guess in a matter of speaking we have, but there are actually on our SharePoint disk or our SharePoint ISO, there is a SharePoint prerequisite installer that we have to go ahead and do first. And it will make sure, again, it'll install certain features and then make sure that our SharePoint is ready to go so that when we actually go ahead and kick off that installation of SharePoint, everything's going to go smooth. So let's go ahead, let's get back to our SharePoint server and take a look. All right, so here we are. We're back on our SharePoint server. You'll see I am signed in as the SP admin, and that's a good thing. That's what we're going to stay signed in as for a long time. All right, let's go ahead now and let's open up our File Explorer because I have mounted our SharePoint disk. Now, you might be tempted to go here to Setup. Let me run that and show you what happens. See that it's telling me that we need to go ahead and run the prerequisite installer. So let's close that. We can do this two ways. We can go right here to the prerequisite installer, or what I want to show you, just because if you have the disk, this is always cool. You get the splash screen, so I'm going to run that. So we get our SharePoint splash screen as if we put the disk in, and we're going to go right down here to the install software prerequisites. Let's click there, and we get this. So let's choose next. We're going to accept the terms and licenses, select next, and now it's going to go ahead and make sure that everything is ready, and if it needs to install any updates or patches or anything like that, it's going to do that. And this is going to take a little bit of time, so I'm not going to sit here and make you watch. I'm going to pause our recording, and I'll be right back. And we're back. And we are finished with the first part of our prerequisite installation. You'll see that my system needs to restart to continue. Now, our system was going to have to restart once, maybe twice. It all depends on what's there, what's not there, your system, and all of that. So what we're going to do is I'm going to click Finish, and the computer will restart, and I'll come back when it's restarted. All right, and we're just about done. It's going to restart now. There we go. That's what we were waiting for. And look at that. I didn't have to do anything. Like I told you, that was not a complete install of our prerequisites. It just restarted, and now automatically it went ahead and continued with the next phase. So once again, we're going to let this continue to run, and we'll come back when it's done. All right, here we are again. This looks familiar, doesn't it? Our system needs to restart to continue. All right, we're going to go ahead and click Finish, and we'll be right back. And here we are again, and once more, we have started, and this should be the last time our computer has to restart. And once again, this is more installing of our prerequisites, and once again, we'll pause here and come back when it's finished. All right, there it is, and we are done. Our installation is now complete of the prerequisites. So we will go ahead and click Finish, and we're done. That's it. All right, now let's go ahead and let's take a look at our start screen, and you will see a few new things, not the least of which is our Internet Information Services, or IIS Manager. All right, well, that's it, gang. We are done. We have successfully completed the prerequisite installation and preparing for the installation of SharePoint on our SharePoint server. Well, that's it for this lesson. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.